Hi, I'm Jampol B. Abaincha, Indigenous Peoples Focal Person. I'm here to share with you some tips on working with Indigenous peoples as being part of the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program. At the end of our session, you will learn what are the features of Indigenous peoples and culture. I will also discuss the cultural discrimination, and in relation to this, as part of the Department of Social Welfare and Development, who promotes the rights of vulnerable sectors, including the indigenous people, we should know the basic rights of indigenous peoples based on the Republic Act 8371 or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. The 4Ps or the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program has different major components, and there are mitigating and enhancement measures we should know. Later, I will discuss these mitigating and enhancement measures to ensure the indigenous people's sensitivity. Do you know that indigenous peoples constitute about 6.2% of the world's population? They are called tribal people, or First Nation, native peoples, and now indigenous peoples. According to the International Labor Organization, there are approximately 476.6 million indigenous people in the world, belonging to 5,000 different groups or ethnic tribes in 90 countries worldwide. Indigenous people live in every region of the world, but about 70% of them live in Asia and the Pacific, followed by 16.3% in Africa, 11.5% in Latin America and the Caribbean, 1.6% in Northern America, and 0.1% in Europe and Central Asia. Examples of indigenous peoples include Inuit of the Arctic, the White Mountain Apache of Arizona, the Yanomami and the Tupi people of Amazon, traditional pastoralists like Maasai in East Africa, and tribal people like Bontoc people of the mountainous region of the Philippines. The Philippines is a culturally diverse country which is about 14 to 17 million indigenous people belonging to 151 ethno-linguistic groups. Approximately 12 to 15% of the population in the country divided into 7 geographical regions. In northern part, we have the Cordillera region and Region 1, Region 2, the Caraballo Mountains, and the rest of Luzon or Sierra Madre Mountains. In the southern part, the southern and eastern Mindanao, central Mindanao, and northern and western Mindanao. For the Mimaropa region, we belong to the island groups, including the IDs of Visayas regions. Indigenous peoples roughly constitute 12 to 15% of the total population of the Philippines and present in the 65 of the country's 78 provinces. The majority of indigenous people are found in Mindanao, which is about 61%. Mostly, they are the Lumads. 33% are found in Luzon. The Mangyans, the Aitas, Igorots, Dumagats, and the Palawan tribes. And 6% in the Visayas, the Ati, and the Tumandok tribes. In our region, as of this year, the total active IP Pantawid beneficiaries is 63,671, which is about 27.69% out of the total active Pantawid beneficiaries of the region. Palawan has the most number of beneficiaries in the region, comprising 68.58%, with the majority of the tribes are Palawan, Cuyonon, and the Tagbalwa. Oriental Mindoro has 15.39%, followed by Occidental Mindoro has 11.52% of the beneficiaries, which the major IP tribes are Mangyan with 10 different sub-tribes. And the lowest number of IP beneficiaries is from Romblon, having 4.5%, with tribes are Sibuyan Mangyan, Bantuanon, and Daati. A very small proportion are from Marinduque, in which the beneficiaries were transferred from the other region. For our first topic, who are indigenous peoples? There is no universally accepted definition of indigenous, though there are characteristics that tend to be common among indigenous peoples. There are three definitions of indigenous peoples based on the Republic Act 8371 or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. Indigenous people is a group of people or homogeneous society identified by self-ascription or ascription by others, who are continually live as organized communities on a community-bound and defined territory. Indigenous people have their own land and territory to which they are tied in numerous ways. Second, those who are under claims of ownership since time immemorial occupied, possessed, and utilized such territories, sharing common bonds of language, customs, traditions, and other distinctive cultural traits. They have their own language, culture, and tradition influenced by living relationship with their ancestral homelands. Today, indigenous people speak different languages. They have distinctive cultural traditions that are still practiced. And indigenous people have self-identity as indigenous. And the last, who have become historically differentiated from majority of the Filipinos through resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-indigenous religions and cultures. Indigenous peoples are distinct population relative to the dominant post-colonial culture of the country. They are often minority populations within the current post-colonial nation states. For example, in other countries, in Bolivia and Guatemala, indigenous people make up more than half of the population. After the features of indigenous people, we will go now to culture. What is the importance of knowing our culture? There is a saying that a people without knowledge of their past, origin, and culture is like a tree with no roots. It is important to know our culture because the culture is the foundation of all learnings. Culture is the totality of our ways of living. Culture is what teaches us about our beliefs. It influences our daily lives from how we act, what we eat, and even what we wear. Knowing our culture is a way of knowing ourselves and what we believe in. And there is also a saying that our culture, our tradition, our language are the foundation upon which we build our identity. Culture is acquired through interaction with others and through socialization. Socialization is the process of learning to behave in a way that is acceptable to society. Indigenous peoples are among the poorest and the most marginalized sectors of the Philippine society. They experience neglect and discrimination in the provision of basic social services by the government. They experience seasonal to chronic food shortage during the year. A major factor causing food insecurity and poverty among indigenous people is the loss of ancestral land due to displacement by development projects and extractive industries including mining, dams, logging, and natural causes. Many of the ethno-linguistic indigenous groups in the Philippines experience discrimination, degradation of resource bases, and armed conflict. IP communities generally located in distinct ancestral territories have high rates of unemployment, underemployment, and illiteracy, while their socio-economic, cultural, and spiritual lives revolve around their ancestral domain, while their socio-economic, cultural, and spiritual lives revolves around their ancestral domains. Indigenous people see their ownership of land shrinking and disregarded. There are two types of discrimination: direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. One of the examples of direct discrimination was recently posted in social media. It is about a family belonging to Aita tribe that was refused to ride in an air-conditioned bus. It is a form of direct discrimination. They are neglected to use the public vehicle because of their appearance being part of indigenous tribe. For indirect discrimination, here is an example. Some of the elders and tribal leaders or common people didn't know how to read in English. The local or national legislative bodies are crafting local ordinances, policies, which are written in the language which common people didn't understand. Depriving of such information can be a form of indirect discrimination because the lack of attributes or the skills to read possessed by a person, especially indigenous peoples in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. Indigenous peoples in vulnerable sectors have limited access to technology. With the recent mandate from the Department of Education on no to face-to-face learning, because of this pandemic, we might indirectly depriving the right of the indigenous people to quality education. It might end up having a delay of learning to be provided to them. There are cultural practices among us. It is also called cultural appropriation. It is an interesting thing. Without it, a culture stagnates or deteriorates, but the blatant use of another's culture, especially for profit, just seems nasty. The proper term would be cultural misappropriation for these instances. Do you know who is Wang Od Ogay? She is a famous native Mambabatok, or the tattoo artist of Kalinga tribe. For now, putting up tattoos is more on fashion, but for them, it is sacred. They are making more tattoos for the protection of their soldiers from the enemy during war. Culture is also used for commercialization. They are using the indigenous culture for profit. Do you remember the TV series Bagani? The prayer to heal the wounded soldiers in the scene? The babaylan sang Mekeni Mekeni Dugdug Doremi. And suddenly, through these influences, it was adopted by IP children and they also sang it. It is the best example of misrepresentation and commercialization of culture. Another thing is the cultural exploitation. Some of the medicines today are influenced by indigenous knowledge. There is a study in which they get a sample of blood from the indigenous people to study how they are immune to malaria. They are treating the IPs like a specimen to be studied about like a typical animal. Indigenous people, especially those in vulnerable and marginalized communities, are prone to abuses and are left behind. For this topic, I will share the basic rights of indigenous people based on the Republic Act 8371 or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997 or the APRA law. There are four bundles of rights of indigenous peoples or the indigenous cultural communities, which are the result of almost a century of fighting for the rights of indigenous people by the different IP advocates and people's organizations. The first one focuses on the identification and protection of the entitlement of indigenous cultural communities or the ICCs and the indigenous peoples as the proper owners of their ancestral land. This was implemented in order to stop the historical injustices experienced by the indigenous people. Despite the implementation of the law since the year 1997, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines still persistently experience injustices. The second bundle of rights is the right to empowerment and self-governance. Based on the law, the state recognizes the inherent right of the indigenous cultural communities or the indigenous peoples to self-governance and which so-called self-determination. Self-determination is the power to decide on your own future. It also respects the integrity of their values, practices, and institutions. They have also the right to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The ICCs and the IPs have the right to use their own commonly accepted justice systems, conflict resolution institution, peace-building processes or mechanism, and the other customary laws and practices within their respective communities, as this may be compatible with the national legal system and with the internationally recognized human rights. This means the government has also the right to intervene whenever there are practices that are against the existing laws or violates human rights. They have also the right to participate at all levels of decision making in matters which may affect their lives through procedures determined by them as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous political structures. The government also gives a mandatory representation in policy-making bodies and other local legislative councils, participate in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of policies, plans, and programs for national, regional, and local development which may directly affect them. The third bundle of rights is the right to social justice and human rights. This chapter in the IPRA law was written to recognize the indigenous people's right to the same privileges and protection also afforded by the state to its citizens. The law re-emphasized that all ICCs and IPs are legally entitled to fundamental universal human rights and that the government should actively create an inclusive environment for them. Among these rights includes equal protection and non-discrimination of ICCs and IPs. It is patterned after international standard set by the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as Equal Protection Clause in the Philippine 1987 Constitution. This section placed the state as duly responsible for the execution of the IP's human rights. The state is then called to acknowledge the ICC's and the IP's position as a vulnerable group that has been historically excluded from socio-economic opportunities and to guarantee that indigenous people enjoy equal protection by the law. The next is the right during armed conflict. As a signatory to the Geneva Convention, the state is expected to respect in all circumstances, including local and international armed conflict. The state, through the National Commission on Indigenous People, is empowered to ensure all civilians, including indigenous people or indigenous last year. The state, through the National Commission on Indigenous People, is empowered to ensure all civilians, including indigenous people or indigenous cultural communities, safety in circumstances of emergency and conflict. It also includes the right to basic services. The law guarantees indigenous people's rights to basic social services as provided by the state. As a vulnerable group, special attention is given for the immediate, effective, and continuing improvement of their economic and social conditions. Example of services that fit this provision include Social Security through the Republic of the Philippines Social Services System, housing, vocational training, and employment support through various efforts of the Department of Social Welfare and Development, as well as complete health coverage through the PhilHealth, no balance billing from the government hospitals. This right includes the protection of the IPs, women, children, and youth. In accordance to the customary law, each tribe, the government must provide mechanism that facilitates a deeper understanding of indigenous culture for women and youth for human dignity. The law ensures the full realization of women and youth rights but requires all mechanisms and programs to be culturally sensitive and relevant to the ICC's or the indigenous people's needs. An example of the programs geared toward the execution of this particular provision of the IPRA law is the Culturally Sensitive Daycare Program for both IB children and their mothers, which the National Commission on Indigenous People mentioned in its first administrative order. The fourth and the last bundle of right is the right to cultural integrity. In a holistic framework, it promotes cultural development and environmental justice by promoting equal rights among local people. It includes the protection of indigenous culture, traditions, institutions, and education systems, the recognition of cultural diversity, the community's intellectual rights, the rights to religious and cultural sites and ceremonies, the right to indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices, or the IKSPs, the right to develop science and technologies, the right to access to biological and genetic resources, and the right to sustainable agro-technical development and funds for archaeological and historical sites. Attempts to implement these rights regarding cultural integrity are most recently captured by the celebration of the National Indigenous Peoples Month from October to November with a unique theme for every year. Every year, there are celebrations to promote and protect the rights of indigenous peoples. There is also Indigenous Peoples Days, which observed annually on the 9th day of August based on the Republic Act number 10689. It also declared as a special working holiday. For our next topic is the IP sensitivity in the major components of Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program. According to the National Advisory Committee Resolution number 29, which the adoption of the Enhanced Indigenous Peoples Participation Framework or the IPPF for the implementation of the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program provides that all projects implemented shall be designed in such a way that indigenous people do not suffer adverse effect during the development process or when avoidance is not feasible to minimize, mitigate, or compensate for such effects. The purpose is the National Poverty Reduction Strategy and Human Capital Investment Program that provides conditional cash transfer to qualified household beneficiaries. It is also a human development program which provides social protection, social assistance, social development, and other complementary support services partnership with the concerned agencies, local government, and other stakeholders towards improving health and nutrition, education, and socioeconomic aspects of their lives. Based on the RA number 11310, specifically stated that indigenous people belongs to the target beneficiaries of the program, since as long as they are qualified to the set criteria. To reduce vulnerability of indigenous people, the problem they are facing must be addressed, taking their voice, cultures, and identities into consideration. The World Bank study recommends 3 things. Number 1, increase participation to protect indigenous rights and reduce social exclusion. Number 2, is to ensure adequate cultural adaptation of services, particularly education, which is crucial for achieving development with respect for their identity. And number three, respond to the needs and new realities of today's indigenous population in taking into consideration. We should remember these three recommendations to address the IP's vulnerability, which is to increase, ensure, and respond. These three are the IP-sensitive measures that we should take into consideration in the implementation of Pantawid program for indigenous peoples. With these measures, we don't separate IPs to non-IPs. Thus, it helps us to assess if the processes implemented is still culturally sensitive for them, considering that the IPs are vulnerable and marginalized. There are processes in the implementation of Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, starting from selection of beneficiaries up to the release of the succeeding grants. With these processes, there are components that are simultaneously operating to ensure the quality of services provided to the partner beneficiaries. Based on the revised operational manual, there are major components of Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, and corresponds to it are the proposed mitigating and enhancement measure based on the Indigenous Peoples Participation Framework, Expanded Social Assistance Project or ESAP. On the beneficiary data management component, there are proposed mitigating measures to lessen or minimize the adverse effect of the program. Number one is to consolidate relevant geographic and demographic data. Under this, we should know the number of indigenous people in the area versus the number of indigenous people Pantawid beneficiaries. And also, we should ask, are there any qualified IP families who are still not included in the program? Next mitigating measure is to produce maps of target beneficiaries in GIDA to provide adequate support to indigenous people, especially women. Under this, we should ask questions. What are the sitios or barangays considered geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas in the municipalities? And how many indigenous peoples, men and women in the area? And the number of IP grantees. Next is to ensure correctness of information and facilitate update requests of IP beneficiaries within the prescribed timeline. Under this, we should ask questions. How many IP beneficiaries have update concerns affecting the compliance to the program's conditions? Is there any update requests for processing concerning IP beneficiaries? And do they have proper documents to support the update's concerns? Tribal chieftain or the NCIP certificate can be an alternate document for birth certificate, marriage certificate, and death certificate, even in change of address for move-out beneficiaries. In case that IP respondent is unable to provide any legal documents during the validation, a certification of the tribal membership duly signed by their tribal leader should suffice. The identified tribal communities or areas must be informed beforehand of the documents they need to present and must be assisted in securing them. Next, and the last mitigating measure for BDM component is the processing of Update 10. This is the update on changing of the IP or tribal affiliation or membership of any members of the household. All identified IP beneficiaries should have tagged IP affiliation based on the recognized list of IPs from the NCIP. One of the supporting documents needed is the certification of tribal membership from the NCIP or the tribal leaders or chieftain. For this measure, we should prepare the list and the code of identified and recognized IP affiliation for the validator's reference in identifying and appropriate marking of the household member's IP affiliation. Second component is the compliance verification system. For beneficiaries in isolated and extremely remote areas, other modes of fulfilling the education requirements that are responsive to the situation, plans, and aspiration of the community will be considered. For this measure, we should ask, do the IPs and GIDAs can continuously comply with the program's conditions despite they are situated in isolated areas? And are there any other modes of fulfilling the program's conditions? Possible option for IP student is the Alternative Learning System or ALS. The program provides a viable alternative to the existing formal education, instruction, encompassing both non-formal and informal sources of knowledge and skills. ALS aims to open more educational opportunities for Filipino citizens of different interests, capabilities, of demographic characteristics, socio-economic origin, and status. The next measure is the conduct of necessary intervention for the concern of the IB beneficiaries on compliance. There are tagging of indigenous peoples cases of non-compliance in the Beneficiary Tracking Report or the BTR. For education and health, those children beneficiaries tagged as Code 19 in the Beneficiary Tracking Report means conflict on culture, belief, or tradition, while Code 27 is the other reasons. For health, it is tagged as Code 24. We should input the specific reason of non-compliance of the IP children. For FDS, those household beneficiaries tagged as Code 18 on the Beneficiary Tracking Report also means conflict on culture, belief, or tradition, and Code 19 for other reasons. The third component is the family development session. One of the measures is to strengthen the consultation process that allows IP communities to critically analyze the unintended consequences of the program that could affect multiple aspects of their lives. The output of the consultation will be an informed decision by the community on if and how to engage the program. For this measure, we should ask, are there any conducted consultation and reflection among IPs before the implementation of the program? Is there any coordination to the IP leaders before the conduct of development sessions? Next measure is the community articulate the purpose and goals they have for education, especially for youth, taking into consideration the unintended impacts. For this measure, we should ask, is the importance of education well explained both to the IP parents and youth during family development sessions? Another measure is to enhance existing tools to determine the needs of both indigenous beneficiaries and implementers in developing gender-sensitive and culturally appropriate community family development session modules and learning materials that serve to strengthen cultural identity. For this measure, we should ask, are the tools during FDS gender-sensitive and culturally appropriate to the IP beneficiaries? And is this strengthen their cultural identity or weaken their identity? And the last, are the FDS modules and learning packages rolled out culturally sensitive and gender responsive? The last measure is in areas where indigenous people considered minority or not comfortable with the presence of many non-IP beneficiaries. FDS should only include IP beneficiaries. For this measure, is there any areas conducting FDS solely for the IP partner beneficiaries? And are there any concerns on FDS being facilitated? The fourth component is the grievance redress system. It institutes capacity building activities for indigenous people to report grievances, issues, and concerns. Facilitate all grievances among IPs and provide them updates. And we should ask questions: are the IP leaders and elders consulted in the facilitation of the program's grievances? And are they being asked in appropriate way regarding grievances filed or during validation of the fact-finding team? And also, we should ask question: are there any grievance mechanism accessible for the IPs? The fifth component is the supply side assessment. For indigenous communities to have an accessible basic services, we should strengthen the partnership with the Department of Education for the integration of the IP education curriculum or the formal schooling, and to strengthen partnership with the DepEd, Indigenous Peoples Education Office, to ensure quality and responsive education for IP learners. For this measure, we should ask: do the IP Pantawid beneficiaries have access to basic services like school? How far are they going to travel to access the facility? Is there any school intended for IP students only? And do they have iPad curriculum? The next measure is to strengthen the partnership with the Department of Health to guarantee culture-sensitive services that respect traditional health and birthing practices by number 1, providing culture-sensitive trainings for health practitioners, number 2, hiring of IP midwives, and number 3 is ensuring information education materials are presented in an IP language or what they are comfortable with. Coordinate with the service providers to offer alternative service delivery option. For example, mobile health teams that provide immunization and other health services in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. For this measure, we should ask: do the IPs have access to health facility? Are the health services provided to IPs culturally sensitive, like immunization? Are there any trainings or orientation provided for the IPs on health? Is there any IP health worker in the municipality or in the barangay? And last, is there any partnership established with Department of Health on ensuring quality health services? And the last measure is to explore partnership with other health services providers in isolated communities, like partnership with NGOs focusing on health. And this measure also aims to involve the communities to explore the possible option to address the issues on health. For this measure, we should ask: is there any CSO partnership established or other health service providers? We should also ask: is the community informed on their issues and provide their recommendation and action to the challenges they have? The sixth component is the cash grant. One of the mitigating and enhancement measures is to ensure the women's safety and practical gender needs during payout. For this measure, we should ask: is there any priority lane for IP women with child or women with practical gender needs during payout? Next is to establish arrangement with the Land Bank of the Philippines and other service providers to ensure payouts are strategically located. For this measure, we should ask: are the IPs in JIDA being considered in payout schedules? Are they prioritized during payout? And the last measure is the consistent processing of payment-related concerns and the proper feedback mechanisms. For this measure, we should ask, are the payment-related concerns of IP beneficiaries being facilitated and processed? Another component is the demand-driven intervention. This component is new to the program, which is specifically intended to provide interventions for the IPs in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. One of the measures is to ensure that the field staff have thorough understanding of diversity of indigenous cultures, possess the ability to develop culturally appropriate strategies, and avoiding one-size-fits-all approach for the proposed intervention for the IPs. For this measure, we should ask, are the proposed demand-driven intervention undergone consultation process and has informed consent among the communities? For hard project, it must undergo prior, informed consent or the FPIC. We should also ask, did the target beneficiaries participate during consultation and agreed on consensus basis? Does the project respond to the needs of the IP community? Is the project culturally appropriate? And are the IP communities involved in monitoring and sustainability of the proposed project? The last component is the social marketing. For this component, we should contextualize IEC or information, education, and communication materials to meet the needs of different target groups like youth, women, indigenous peoples, elders, and others. For this measure, we should also ask, do IEC materials provided meet the needs of different target groups, and does the municipal team strategize to produce IEC materials that are culturally appropriate to the IP beneficiaries? And the next measure is the documentation of the IP's good practices in the implementation of the program. For this measure, we should ask, do we have success stories featuring our IP beneficiaries such as stories of pagtawid sa kahirapan? Now we have learned the mitigating measures in the major components of the Pantawid program. Let me share some advices for being an IP worker. Let us remember the word understand as the attitude a worker should always have. U stands for understand our own culture. We must understand our own culture in order to understand them. N stands for need to invest time. We need to invest time to really know what their struggles are. D stands for deep respect. We must have deep respect to their cultures and traditions. E stands for enthusiast. We should also be enthusiastic in communicating with them. R stands for realize. We should realize that their wisdom has an origin and it is from their ancestors.
S stands for simplicity and humility. Be simple and humble when conducting field visit to the IP communities for them to be comfortable in your discussion.
T stands for total openness. We must have total openness in accepting their living practices but not violate someone's dignity and human rights. A stands for attitude of listening. Don't forget to have an attitude of listening when doing conversation with them. N stands for we need to bring infinite patience. We also need to bring infinite patience when conducting dialogue with them. And last, D stands for don't think your culture is superior. Don't think your culture is superior to them because diversity is not to be compared. It should be respected. To sum it up, we have learned the different features of culture and indigenous peoples. You become aware and heard some examples of discrimination and social marginalization among them. You gain some knowledge in protecting the vulnerable IP groups through knowing the basic rights based on the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act or the IPRA law, such as the right to ancestral domain, the social justice and human rights, the right to self-governance and empowerment, and the rights to cultural integrity. As a DSWD worker, we have learned how we should work with our IP partner stakeholders and IP beneficiaries, considering the proposed mitigating measures in the major components of the Pantawid Pamilya Filipino program. Culture and IP sensitivity are very important for us as DSWD workers because we are working in a region having diverse group of people and communities. We have differences that must be respected and must be cultivated for the other generation to serve as a foundation of their learning. All these steps will serve as our guides in implementation of the program for our indigenous peoples Pantawid beneficiaries. We are doing this to safeguard their rights and for them as being part of the vulnerable and marginalized sectors of the community. I hope that all of your learnings will be applied as you work with our IP beneficiaries, communities, fellow staff, and program partners. Have a blessed day, everyone. Again, I'm John Paul B. Abaencia, Indigenous Peoples Focal Person, DSWD Mimarota.
Bye.